Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to another session. In this session, we are going to learn about routings in ASP.NET Core APIs. So what is routing and why we require the routing? So basically, routing we require in order to identify which action method from the controller you need to call or which API we need to execute, because in a same controller we can have multiple APIs, or in a same project we can have multiple controllers. So each web API should have its own unique identifier to call that API from the browser. So that's why we require the routing. Okay, so let me open the project, API project which we created last time. Yeah, so this is the API project we had created. In this project, what we done so far, we have created this book controllers and the author controller. In the book controller, we have created one API, that is get all books, and this get all books API is basically returning list of all the books. Now, what kind of routings we need to implement in this controller? So here, if you notice, we are having route attribute already added by Microsoft. When we create a new project, it will automatically add the route attribute here. So this route attribute basically indicates that what will be your routing pattern, URL pattern. So your URL pattern is your hosting name, okay, slash controller forward slash action. So if you write the controller and action in a square bracket, it means it will use the actual name of your controller and actual name of your action method. Okay, so this is your controller slash action. But if you want to use this name, okay, get all books, this name as a action, let's say your action name and this name might be different. Okay, so if you want to use that, you can just remove this action, and then it will give a preference to this name, not this one. Okay, now let's check what are all types of routing we can add. So first of all, we can add routing is just for without any name like this. Okay, if I remove this one, if I just only keep HTTP get, and if I change method name to get, so this is your default routing. Okay, means controller slash action. This is your default routing, and in the route, this one you can just add like this. So it will call this method when you pass the HTTP get as a method. Okay, there are various methods like HTTP get, HTTP post, HTTP put, patch, delete. But if you pass HTTP get only, then it will give a call to this method by default. Because this is RESTful APIs. RESTful API can understand the endpoint by using the method name also. HTTP works also. Like if you have only one API which is having get attribute, it means you are trying to call this API only. Let's call this API in the browser. Yeah, you can see the output here. There is a get all authors API available. Okay, why all authors? Let me check. Okay, in the book controller, there is a book get API is available, right? So book is a controller name, and as it is get, you don't have to mention the action method name, because there is only one API which is having the get attribute. Okay, so if you call tryout, click on execute, you can see that API is got call. Okay, you don't have to explicitly mention the action method name. But in your controller, if you are having more than one get more than one API with the get attribute, in that case you will have to mention the action name also. Okay, so this is your default routing. Default routing means you don't have to mention the action name. Okay, you just have to mention the controller name like this. This is your host name, http localhost colon 7227. This is your host name. After that, whatever we have added here, that is your controller name. And after the controller name, you don't have to mention anything because there is only one API in the controller having get HTTP verb. Okay, so that's why you can call that API without their name. This is your default routing. If someone asks you what is default routing, then you should able to tell that. Okay, now let's assume in the same controller we are having one more API which is get action. Okay, get method. So this API name is get book info. Let's assume. Okay, we are having one API having get book, and this is get book info, and this API basically returning only one book. Let's assume. Okay, in this case, if you rerun this application, it will throw you one exception. What kind of exception? The compiler will confused. There are two APIs having HTTP GET, and compiler will not sure which API need to call when user pass the controller name and no action name. If we try to pass localhost 2207 slash book, then compiler will get confused which API need to call because there are two web APIs having the HTTP GET method. Got it? So that's why in that case what we can do, we need to mention the action name also. Okay, here compiler now confused. If you only provide the controller name with no action name, in that case compiler will confuse whether to call this API or this API. That's why if you see in the browser here, there is a error. What is the error? Let's check the error. You can just copy this JSON file path, open new tab, paste here, open it. Okay, this is the error. Conflicting method or path combination. Get book for action. It means when you're trying to call book controller dot get, there are conflict. Conflict means more than one method found. So in this case, you will have to mention the specific name to another method. This one, get info. So this is, we can mention like this. Let me stop it. Here in the HTTP GET attribute, you can mention the action name also. Okay, so your URL will be your controller name slash action name book info. Okay, let's try it now. I'm just running this again. Okay, now you can see the output. Yeah, now you can see there are two APIs. One is default API, second one is custom API. So if your API, web API, does not have any action name in the code here, it means that is your default API from the controller. But if you want to add more than one API having HTTP GET attribute or POST attribute or any other verbs, in that case, you will need to mention here the unique name for that endpoint. So for this API, your endpoint will be controller name slash action name. This is not action name, but your API name, book info, whatever you mention here. Okay, so it will give a call to this API. But if you want to call the default API by using the controller, it will by default call this API. Okay, so we just learned two types of routing. One is default routing and second one is specific routing. Whatever name you have mentioned, that is your specific routing. Okay, now third type of routing is you can pass the parameters through the URL. Okay, how we can pass the parameter to the API? Let's see. Before that, let me show you how to call this another API. You can just go here. This will be your URL. Okay, what is the URL? I will show you. This is your URL. Host name, controller name slash book info. Okay, so this is your URL to call newly created API, and it will just give you the response like this. It means as we got the response, it means this endpoint is correct. Okay, so here you are going to call specific API by mentioning their name here. Okay, but in above example, you are calling the API without any action name. You can see host name slash controller name only. There is no action name. Still, it is giving a call to this API. Why? Because that is your default API, which is having HTTP GET attribute. Okay, if so, then it will give a call to that default API without mentioning the action name. You can only mention the controller name and that's it. Okay, so this is default API. This is your specific web API. Now next is, okay, next is how to pass the parameter while calling the API. Okay, let's say I want to create one more API which will accept book ID as a parameter. Okay, so here book info is the API name. I want to pass one more parameter, that is ID. Okay, so that parameter you can just have here as a parameter like this. Get book info. You can see both the APIs are having the same name, but this API takes ID as a parameter. Okay, so if that is the case, let me just return one thing here. I want to return only one string, so that way we can distinguish between the output. Okay, this is get info web API. Okay, then return this output. This is get info API with ID parameter like this. So we can distinguish the output, like we can confirm which API we call from the Swagger UI. Now you can see this is your default API. This is your another version of the get API having no parameters. And this is one more example of the get API having one parameter. Okay, so we can pass the parameter like controller name slash action name slash parameter, and whatever parameter or integer ID you will provide as a part of URL, it will bind automatically to this ID parameter. Okay, so what we can do, ID is equal to, here we can just mention print that value, so we can confirm whether whatever parameter we have sent got mapped to this ID variable or not. Okay, so what we are doing, whatever parameter we will send through the UI, it should get mapped with this ID value, ID parameter, and that ID parameter should be print in this message. Okay, ID is equal to actual ID like this. This is interpolation. We already learn in C sharp. Okay, so let's run this program. Okay, Now this is the output. You can see there are three versions of our book API. One is default, second one is specific version where we mention the uh, our custom endpoint name without any parameter. Now this is another version where we are having the parameter. So if you run this without parameter, click on execute, you can see the output. This is your get info API. Now I wanted to pass the parameter while calling the get info API. Why we require to pass the parameter? Because let's say there are 100 of books available in the database. I want the information of the book which is having ID is equal to 10. So that case, I should be able to pass the ID as a parameter. Okay. So you can see this ID we can pass here as a 10. And if I click on the execute, it will return you the output like this. Where is the output? This is the output. This is the get info web API with ID equal to 10 parameter. It means whatever ID we have passed through the URL, you can see this is your full URL. URL is hostname slash controller name slash action name slash ID parameter. Whatever parameter we have mapped here, that got bind to the ID variable, and that ID variable we have printed inside the output. You can see this 10 here. Okay. So this is completely dynamic. If you pass, let's say 50. Okay. Here you have just passed 50 and click on the execute button. So your output will change. This is get info web API with 50 parameter. It means whatever parameter we are sending from the Swagger UI, that parameter is getting bind with this ID variable, and that variable we have printed in the output here. Okay. So this is your another example for routing. Okay. Now one last example on the routing, and then we will wrap up this topic. Okay. Last example can be, let's say you want to pass more than one parameter in the UI. How we can map them to the correct variable? Okay. I want to pass two things. One is book category and book ID. Okay. So if you want to pass more than two parameter, it is very simple. It is same like previous example. Here you can just mention category slash ID. So this category variable should be bind with this parameter, and this ID variable should be bind with this parameter. So that we can just mention like this. So book info is the API name, forward slash category is whatever category you will mention here, that will get assigned to this variable. Whatever ID you will mention here, that will get assigned to this another variable. Okay. And that we will just print inside your message to confirm whether both the parameters got bind with the correct variables or not. So this is the get info web API with category is equal to category value. Okay. And ID is equal to ID parameters. Okay. So let's run this program again. Hold, sorry. Uh, Now there are four versions. Book as a default parameter, then book info without any parameter, book info with ID parameter, book info with category and ID parameter. If I expand this one, pass the category, let's say drama. Okay. ID, let's say 10. Click on the execute button. Here you can see this is the API with category equal to drama and ID is equal to 10. It means whatever value we have passed through the parameter, through the URL, got bind with the correct parameter. Okay. So whatever we have mentioned in the category variable, that is assigned to the in the category section in the URL, that got assigned to the category variable. Here we mention ID, that got assigned to the ID variable. How we had confirmed that? By using this output. Category is equal to drama and ID is equal to 10. Got it? So this is all about the routing. I hope you got understanding of routing, how to configure the routing in .NET Core API and why it is required. So basically routing we require in order to create multiple endpoints and identify them by using the URL pattern. Okay, so browser should not be confused if there are multiple methods or APIs having the same endpoint or same URL, then browser will get confused which API we need to call. So that's why your routing should be unique across the whole application. Okay, whatever API you are going to write, it should have the unique path or unique URL so that your browser can understand which API we need to call, and accordingly you will get the output. Okay, so this is all about routing. We can stop here.